Alright, we are finishing up week 14. Day 26. Alright, so let's take a look at what we did. Networking. We did the other quiz, and we talked a little bit about that. We did the assessment for Unit 2, and we started talking about security, and we asked the students to take the quiz before they start in on Chapter 11. We're going to finish Chapter 11 the upcoming week, and also we'll do the skills based at the end of the week, and that'll all be explained on Monday. So let's talk about I spent a little bit of time, we talked about network design, putting devices on a network, what protocols we use for small networks, and how can those small networks eventually scale. Now we should think of scaling as getting bigger or even getting smaller, depending on which way you want to scale. So some people only think scaling is getting bigger, but sometimes you have to shrink networks down. You sell off a certain division, a certain store closes or whatever. Another thing is the whole idea of the physical design. We did a little bit of work on that, talking about vertical cabling and horizontal cabling and the length and the wiring closets and that hierarchy and some rules to follow. We don't go into that anymore. A lot of that's farmed out at businesses, certain businesses that just do all the wiring, and we talk about some examples. But it's good to know enough about that so when you get in a small example and you have to make some adjustments now before you hire a big company to come in and do it, you're able to do that. The other thing we talked about here was security. And what are we concerned about securing data? And the chapter goes through and talks about that, some major areas like configuration. You can configure the devices poorly and not be security updates of iOS and software and so forth. And then other protections, okay? So let's just take a look. And the configuration, what we do a lot of focus on, because you want a device configured poorly that allows people to get in. Let's take a look at data security in general. 3 things. Confidentiality, who can see the data, who has access to what data. Integrity, is the data kept accurate? Okay, make sure the data hasn't changed. And we have to make data available. Of course, if we didn't have to make data available, it would be pretty secure. But because we have to make it available, we have to be conscientious of making sure the data remains, the integrity of the data remains, and the right people can see the data, okay, in whatever kind of work environment that we're in. Where is the data? What state is the data in? It could be stored, right? Data could be on a storage device somewhere. In networking, we tend to think sometimes more the data in transit, moving between 2 locations, and then while it's being processed, while it's in the processor. We tend to focus a little more on this in the networking class, even though obviously these other things are very important also. What can we do? We have products and devices. We have virus software, we have firewalls, we have different devices that allow intrusion protection to systems and so forth. We have products, we have all kinds of software we can use to help secure our data. That makes sense? Hopefully. This next one now, we have procedures, and for us, this is an easy one to define. How you configure the device, what procedure do you use to configure a device so it's configured and the security and the integrity of the device remains, okay? In business, they create policies that people have to follow. Example would be, if you tell people they have to change their password, then, or you force them, then they have to have a procedure to understand how to change a password. That might sound simplistic, but you could extend that out into a lot of examples. We also mentioned guidelines. They're like policies, but not, maybe not enforced and stringent. You know, it's not as required, maybe. You might say, an easy example, you might say, you ought to change. Our guideline is to change your password every month, but if you don't get it changed for every 5 weeks or 6 weeks, whatever, and some policies might force you to change your password every 30 days or 60 days or whatever. And then the crux of security is wrapped around people. You know, do you give people the right procedures in order for them to follow policy? How do you guide people into doing the correct things and not clicking on things they shouldn't click on? All right. People might be the key, you know, really, when you think about it. Ethical people, and you tell them, you know, don't do this, don't do that, okay, and they follow what you ask them to do. That's one of the greatest avenues of security you can get. That is my opinion. You can believe and I believe that. All right. What happens? We talk about people can scan. You can gather tons of information about networks and so forth and who's running what in a network. So you have this ability to find out lots of information. And that can lead into maybe areas where you're looking where you're not supposed to be looking. So it can start out perfectly legal and then all of a sudden end up being illegal. What happens in a lot of areas is they look for vulnerabilities, old software not being updated and so forth. You know, what kind of vulnerabilities exist, okay? A threat. Is there a threat to that vulnerability? And then, if there is there somebody that can actually carry the threat out? So once you take all that, you develop some level of risk. Are you going to mitigate the threat, try to stop it? Or are you going to pass the threat to somebody else? Like, if you're worried about storage of data, okay, well, you could pass that responsibility to somebody in the cloud. If you don't want to manage security with emails, you could pass that to somebody in the cloud and pay somebody to take it. Or moving it to somebody else, you can get insurance to cover the risk. That's what people do in their houses and cars, and you know, it's hard to cover or stop your house from burning down sometimes, you know. You never know what happens. Lightning hits it just right or whatever. So we get insurance to cover that. This is a big deal for companies. They have to calculate the risk, you know, how much they want to spend to mitigate it or leave it. And a lot of companies, they take on a little more risk because it's just too expensive to mitigate it. It's hard to stop all hackers in all scenarios. It is really hard. All right. Yeah, so we finished up the class. We did a little bit of work on some IP addressing, looked at that quiz and so forth, and then the students took the Unit 2 assessment. And next week's a big week. Monday we're going to do a lab and talk about things from Chapter 11. We'll finish up Chapter 11 on Friday. We'll do the skills-based. We'll do just routers on Friday, but they'll have students have an hour to configure a router and get connectivity going out to the internet from a workstation. And then on Monday we have the final. We'll also take the practice final this week too. All right, that's it for today. Class on Friday we did some work